Racing games often leave aside the damage model as a priority, and it might not sound like a big deal, but it makes quite a lot of difference to the way you race. Today, we'll see the differences between several games in this area, and we'll see who has got this right and who has failed here. We'll also see what difference it makes when it comes to racing. I'll say this from the start, Formula 1 16 is the clear winner here, and possibly the best game in terms of damage I have ever played. This was historically a weak aspect of the Codemasters Formula 1 series, but they have turned it around this year. For years, they always used Formula 1 management as a scapegoat to explain why their game was so poor regarding damage, but it was easy to see it was just an excuse. When people asked why the damage sensitivity was so low, they always replied to a different question. They argued they could not show any further damage to the cars because Formula 1 management would not allow it. What people wanted was not to see destroyed monocoques or crashed sidepods. People wanted contact to have consequences, so wall riding was not possible and contact with other cars was dangerous. Everything needed was in the game. Terminal suspension damage was already modeled in, but it took full speed crashes for it to show. What they called full damage was a joke, and players were able to get away with all sorts of nonsense. This year, they finally grew a pair, and they have included a damage setting that punishes players for their mistakes. What they have done is to add a new option called simulation damage, and I must say that it lives up to its name. What it does is the same thing that many user mods did for previous games. It reduces the energy needed to trigger all the damage that is already in the game. The front wing gets damaged easier, the wheels fall off the car with lighter impacts, and the strength of all the components gets much more in line with a real Formula 1 car. This change really improves the overall experience. Big mistakes will end with a DNF every time, and small incidents are very likely to leave you with a car that does not perform as it should. In a game where the AI tends to get out of your way a bit too much, a big punishment for contact was needed. At the same time, urban tracks are a very different story when you are very likely to end the race if you touch a wall. It doesn't matter if an incident is your fault or not, you will always pay for it. This makes you drive with much more awareness, and self-preservation becomes a thing. No sane player will throw a dive bomb in a multiplayer game with this setting activated. Another cool detail is that AI cars seem to be affected the same way that your car from this setting, so you get to see some retirements when there's an incident. Here's a good example. Smaller crashes also benefit from this setting. Lighter contact with other cars is very likely to cause front wing damage. That damage also has different degrees and different effects on the car.
We're seeing minor damage to the front wing. Be easy on the car till we get it repaired. We don't want to risk making this worse.
Now, let's compare all of this with other games. First, let's talk about Assetto Corsa. Even with full damage activated, this game simply will not punish crashes enough. This incident is a good example. Hitting a concrete wall almost head-on will just cause light damage to the car. I bounce back to the track and get on with it again. The car will barely lose any performance, and this should have been a retirement. Even huge accidents are not race ending. If I wanted, I could have continued driving here. So, what about project cars? This game is in between the other two. For some cars, the damage model is fairly good, like the Formula E. Hitting a wall will make you lose a wheel almost every time. You can limp back to the pits, and that isn't very realistic, but when you consider how many different types of cars this game has, this is still reasonable. You will always lose a lot of time if you crash, and that's enough. But then, you select a different car and everything changes. You could have the worst possible crash and keep going. After this one, I just switched on the car again and I was on my way. It is true that the steering got damaged and the car was a bit of a handful after this, but I should be out of the race 10 out of 10 times after a crash like this. But damage isn't the only thing Formula 116 got right regarding crashes. Let's say you are in a qualifying session and you crash. If you damage your car, you'll have to get back to the pits, losing a lot of time. Or you could go back to the pit lane using the menu, but the game will still take time away from your session. If you are online, this last option doesn't even exist. And what happens when you get to the pit lane? You have to watch how the car arrives to the pit box, and then you have to watch a long animation. Probably the main idea was just looking good, but it has the side benefit of costing you more time. Cars don't respawn with new tires and the correct fuel load. Preparing for another qualifying attempt takes time, and the game reflects that nicely.
To spend time repairing the damage to the
And after all that time, when you want to go out again, another long animation gets in the way. An incident in any part of the qualifying session will disrupt it a lot for you, and that's great. You have to keep your brain engaged all the time, including out laps and in laps. And what happens if you have a big one and bin the car? The same as in a real qualifying, your day is over. In single player, you get this screen allowing you to restart or retire. In multiplayer, you are out and you have to wait until the race starts. Now, what will happen in Project Cars in the same situation? Let's say you are in a hot lap and you crash out. Once it happens, you could always do this, and you are given a new car with new tires and the correct fuel load in a fraction. You do an outlap and you are good to go again. In a normal track, you are always under 2 minutes away from starting a hot lap, no matter what you have done. This makes the qualifying sessions a bit of a joke. You can mess up badly, make a really absurd mistake, and still recover immediately and score pole position. Watching it all from the TV camera shows how ridiculous this is. All racing games should make an effort to imitate what Formula 116 has done with damage and crashes. We are talking about two different things here. The first is getting the damage model right. Doing it for very different classes can be a challenge, so I understand why it might be tricky for games like Project Cars and Assetto Corsa to achieve this. It doesn't have to look amazing, parts don't have to come off or break with awesome animations. What we really need is the consequences being accurate and proportional to the type of crash you had. A big crash has to be race-ending. A crash likely to cause damage to the real car should cause a similar loss of performance in the game. The other part is how a crash affects your session. There's no excuse to get this wrong. In multiplayer races, you should always have to drive back by yourself to the pits, and if you can't, your session should be over. Having a get out of jail button makes everything feel quite cheap, and it promotes kamikaze driving, knowing you can always be back to the pits instantly and start another lap in a very short time. If you get out of the pits with less than 5 minutes to go, you should cope with the idea that it is going to be your last qualifying run. And that is the end of this rant. Feel free to air your thoughts on this topic with a comment, and as always, thanks for watching.